So today we are talking about some advanced filtering and paths with Dubsado and Zapier. So in the last couple of webinars, we first looked at just the basics of Zapier, how to get your first Zap set up, and what that looks like using it with Dubsado. We, in the second webinar, looked at taking things, switching them around using a different app, specifically Typeform, to trigger a new project to be created in Dubsado through that Zap. And we kind of started to touch on filters at the end, but today we're kind of diving in on these more advanced techniques of using filtering and paths to create conditional logic. So that's what these tools are for. Instead of one linear Zap that just fires every time the trigger is met, we're introducing some things that can help us kind of let Zapier know when we want the filter or when we want the Zap to run and when we don't, or if we want it to do something different based on the data it receives from the trigger app or another app if you're really building these out with a lot of steps. So in our handout, as usual, not too different at the top here. This is definitely not a beginner webinar. If you're not familiar with Zapier, go back and watch the other two. We actually have a help article in our help center where I'm putting all the Zapier videos together in one place. So definitely check out the Dubsado Help Center if you need to catch up on those replays. But definitely, just being familiar with how lead capture works, field mapping, and custom map fields in Dubsado, having that basic knowledge will help you be successful in Zapier as well, because a lot of it actually transfers over. And I maybe should say workflows as well, although Zapier works a little bit differently in the automation department. So what you'll need, and I'm going to use some examples to go through filters and paths today, working actually off of the Zaps that we built in the last two webinars. So I'm not, kind of going too deep into exactly what you need to build these Zaps. I'm trying to set you up to get to a place where you are ready to kind of take this as inspiration and use your own process to fill in the gaps. But you will definitely need for this a paid Zapier account. So pretty much everything we've covered up to this point, you've been able to do with a free Zapier account, which is awesome. If you're wanting to take things to this next level, you will need a starter level plan or above for filters, or a professional level plan or above for using paths. Again, I just want to reiterate, we are not affiliated with Zapier. I'm not affiliated with Zapier. Don't work for Zapier, but just trying to give you the information that you need. So these features are only available in those higher tiered accounts. And of course, you'll need Zapier connected to Dubsado, which hopefully you've done by this point if you've been experimenting and following along. All right, let's jump into filters. So a filter in Zapier works like a stop sign. So you get to set one or more rules that basically determine whether or not the Zap gets to continue. So essentially, you're just adding another step into your Zap to say, hey, Zapier, so I know you got this trigger going, you got triggered. Now in this next step, can you make sure that certain data in that trigger meets my rules? So that's what a filter is doing. So generally you want to use a filter when it's kind of a yes or no situation. If the data from the Zap meets the rules, yes, we want to continue. If not, the Zap stops at that point. So this is kind of like a yes-no situation. So in order to demonstrate this, we're going to go back to, kind of looking at that first Zap we set up, looking to, send new Dubsado leads over to a spreadsheet row in Google Sheets. And again, this is just an example. This could be any other action here from any other app that you have. You could set up a task in Asana every time you get a new project in Dubsado. You could, send someone over to your mailing list if that's what you wanted to set up. So there's all sorts of different apps you could, put in here instead of sending over to a Google Sheet. Google Sheet is great if you want to collect some data and have that compiled. So, you need to decide what is necessary in your business. But to show you how this would work, let's say in your Dubsado account, you have a lot of different lead capture forms. Let me jump over there right now. So in Dubsado, this is my demo account. So I have lots of different lead capture forms happening here. So there's, lots of different ones that could fire off. Maybe you want to keep a separate spreadsheet for leads coming in through a specific lead capture form. The example I thought of is I know a lot of you folks are in the wedding industry, and you might go to a bridal show and be using a lead capture at the bridal show, maybe on an iPad or something for potential clients to sign up to get some more information from you. So maybe you want to send all of those leads over to a specific spreadsheet or mailing list or what have you, but you don't want this to be the same list as maybe your standard lead capture form on your website. So how do you separate these out? Because right now with this trigger new project as a lead in Dubsado, every time you get a new project as a lead in Dubsado, this Zap will fire. So we're trying to filter out any new leads that are created not with the criteria that we want. So what we do is we have our 2 steps here. In the middle, I'm going to click this plus button to add an additional step. And this is where we're going to add a filter. So it's right here under the helpers. I'll click filter. And now we want to set up our rules. So you have 3 boxes here. In the handout, I kind of broke this down for you. So these 3 boxes, what do they mean? The first one is the field. So from our last webinars, you should be familiar with the idea that when a Zap is triggered, it's pulling certain information or data over from one app, and that is stored in a bunch of different fields, just like it is in Dubsado: first name, last name, email, etc. So each separate piece of data is stored in its own field. So that's the first box. We're saying, hey, look at the data in this spot. The second box is the condition. So when setting up a rule, we need to tell it, exactly how we want it to look at that data and filter out. So we'll take a look at that. And then in the last box, you're putting in the data that you are looking for. So to tie this together, we want to only continue if the title. So in Dubsado, if you want to filter by which lead capture it is, the easiest way to do this is using the lead capture title, what you titled the form. So the title, and remember, we have some old test data in there, so it's not necessarily the one we want to look at. It's just pulling in whatever test data you had. But we do want to look at the lead capture title. And the criteria is that I want the title to contain the text. So text contains, so you have a bunch of different options here. Text does not contain, text exactly matches. You could do exactly matches and type that out exactly the title. Starts with, ends with. You want to choose the condition that best allows you to filter out the lead captures. So I'm just going to do text contains bridal show. And what this means is if I created multiple lead captures with all with the words bridal show in the title, this Zap would still fire. So you want to keep that in mind. Maybe if you want to be very specific just to one lead capture, you want to use text exactly matches instead. I'm okay with text contains. So we're choosing the field, the condition, and the data that are making up our rule here. And if you had more conditions, maybe an or would be if you want the Zap to continue if it meets this criteria or another set of criteria. Or maybe you need to do something with and it needs to meet 2 pieces of criteria. So that would be setting up a rule where it now has to meet both pieces of criteria. We'll just stick with the one rule for now. Next, you'll click continue to test it out. So it's going to look at the sample data that was pulled in the trigger, and it's going to let you know if it if it met the rule or not, essentially letting you know if the Zap would have continued. In this case, the Zap would not have continued because the sample data we have, the lead capture form that was filled out was this wedding photography inquiry that we used last time. So that's fair. We can see at least that it's filtering that out, but if we also want to make sure that it's going to work on something that should pass the filter, let's go back up to our first step right here, and let's find some new data. So at this point, if you remember, we need to generate some sample data for Zapier to look at. So I'm going to go back to choose account, find data. Oh, great. It's pulling in new projects from here. So I have, this is the bridal show lead capture. I pulled it up, filled it out. And remember, you want to submit that new data right before looking for it in Zapier. So I'm sending it now. And at this point, from this dropdown, I can click load more. The interface has changed a little bit since our first webinar. Okay, great. So this one is pulling in March 31st, 2:13 p.m. That's where I'm at right now. Awesome. So now we can review the information from this sample project. Yes, the title is Bridal Show, and it contains all that info that I entered. So this looks like the right one. So I'll click Done Editing on that, and we'll go back to our filter and the setup and testing. And the rule is still the same, but we're going to click Continue again to retest. And now we're seeing that success message. The Zap would have continued. The title contained the words Bridal Show. So you can see how this is a really powerful tool to make sure that your Zaps are only running at specific times. And part of the reason this is important, not only to make sure that everyone is going to the right place and going onto the right spreadsheet, but the other thing that's important about this is, part of your Zapier account is it does, limit the amount of tasks it can run on a monthly period. So if you just have Zaps running unnecessarily and, kind of creating all these additional entries somewhere that you didn't want, that's also eating into your task allowance on Zapier. So what happens with a filter is if the filter does not pass, Zapier doesn't count additional tasks beyond that. So this is, a good way to make sure your account is running efficiently. So that is everything with filters. Again, it acts like a stop sign. The Zap only continues if those rules are met. Back in our notes here, again, you have a little diagram I made up for you with, how to set up the rule. And again, just remember that you may need to set up a new piece of sample data to retest the Zap in a couple different ways, just to make sure it's working as you expect. So that's the filters. All right, let's move on to paths. So a path in Zapier is used to create if-then scenarios in your Zaps. But now we're going to have multiple outcomes. So with the filter, it was a yes or no. In the path, it's more of a B, or C kind of deal. So now instead of just one Zap with one filter and it stops or goes, now we can have a Zap with multiple outcomes at the end, which is pretty cool. But we're going to set up the rules in very much the same way. I have a Zap open here that we looked at in the second webinar of the series at the end, when I started talking about when you're maybe using a form other than a Dubsado lead capture form to bring new leads into Dubsado, create those new projects in Dubsado. We looked at using Typeform for this, how you could replicate the behavior of a workflow element on a Dubsado lead capture. So we looked at having kind of a multiple choice, well, really, where the client can only select one option. So you have to kind of set it up similar to how it would be on a lead capture form. And based on that selection they make, filtering that out. So in this example, we were saying, if the client selects logo design for the question, what can I help you with? Then this Zap continues and we create a new project. And as we do that, we're starting the logo design workflow. And using filters with this, you'd have to create multiple Zaps to get this effect. So you'd have to have one Zap for each of the different outcomes using a single filter in each. Well, in this situation, using a path, we can have just one Zap. And, your Zapier account does also have a limit on the number of Zaps you can have running at any given time. So this might be helpful for that. But ultimately, it just helps to logically think about, every time we have a new entry in type form, we're going to look at that answer and filter what happens accordingly. So to set this up, I'm actually going to remove these two steps. I'm going to take out the filter and I'm going to take out the create project. The reason for this is that when you add a filter, or excuse me, when you add a path, it has to be the very last action in the Zap as it's currently set up. So a couple things to think about here. Number one, if there are any actions that you want to have happen for every new entry into your type form in this case, no matter what they chose on that box, put those actions in first. So maybe you want to put in, adding those entries to a Google Sheet, for example. If there's anything that applies to all, put those actions in first. I'm not going to build this out right now. Then, after you have all of those kind of common actions in place, now you can add in the path. So you see this option right here under helpers. We'll click paths. And that will set up right here. So it's going to set up to start with 2 paths. So you can essentially, these are kind of like Zaps within a Zap. So for path A, I can click edit. It's going to ask you to name it. I really recommend that if you're using this technique to kind of simulate a workflow element on a lead capture form, name your paths to match the workflow names. That way they're easy to identify. If we left it as path A, it's kind of meaningless. So I know that one of them is logo design. So I'll name the path that. And this is just for your own organization, and it does make a big difference to be able to tell these apart. And this should look very, very familiar, the rule setup. So this is exactly like putting in a filter. It's the exact same process. All we have to do is in our first box, we're going to look for the field. So let's find the how can I help field. Great. And in this one, we will say, let's do text exactly matches. And in this case, we'll put logo design. And if you're going to use a text exactly matches, you want to be very careful. Make sure that you are entering that text exactly as it would come over into Zapier. If you're having troubles getting it to pass, it might be an inaccuracy in what you typed in this box. All right, so let's click continue. And as expected, the path would not have continued because the answer to this one, our test data, was brand audit. So when you're doing paths and you get to the testing portion, you'll have to decide, how much testing you want to do. If you want to be thorough about it, I would recommend creating sample data. It would be a different entry of sample data each time, one each, matching each of the paths so that you can fully test and make sure each path would have continued as you've set it up. So we'll click done editing there. And now this sort of becomes the trigger in a way. And the next step is going to be your action. So in our case, it would be creating a new project in Dubsado. So I will go through the steps of getting that set up. And right here, the very first setting that you put in is the workflow. And this is really the only setting that's changing, in this situation from path to path. It just so happens that, the way the Dubsado action is set up, we can't directly pipe the answer to that question right into which workflow is done. So we can only choose one workflow at a time, and that's how the path is helping us here. So I know I have one for logo design. There we go. So you're just following this through. You set up the rule to match the right answer, and then you're setting up the create project in Dubsado action with the right workflow that matches that answer too. And then you would go through and set up the rest of this, putting in the important client details, etc., and test that at the end. Right up here at the top, there's a drop down that allows you to toggle between the different paths. So now I can go to path B, and this one can be the brand audit. And again, we set up our rules. So new entry and type form, we'll find our field that we're looking at. Text exactly matches brand audit. Great. I'll click continue, and this path would have continued, which is great. So we can see that. Sometimes, and this may have improved, but sometimes Zapier gets a little stuck on old samples occasionally when you're retesting things like filters and paths. So if it doesn't pass the first time and you're like, wait, this actually does really match, just kind of go back and test it again, and it should pass that second time. But we can see here that it is passing. And you would follow through that same step. You're kind of just repeating yourself here, setting up the action in Dubsado, but now just choosing a different workflow. This is the only thing that's changing between the two paths is which workflow we are selecting as we customize the new project. So if we close out of this, back in our Zap, once again, we have a single trigger. We have some actions that apply to everything coming in from that particular trigger. And then we also have some additional paths to conditionally run a different action or actions with different settings as we just put together based on certain rules. And you could continue adding additional paths as well if you needed them. You could expand on this further. I mean, you can use filters and paths in the same Zap. So if we needed to filter something out at this stage, I could add a filter right in here. You can also do paths within paths. So if your process is really quite robust and extensive, once you're inside one of these individual paths, you can put in more filters or another path. As long as it's the last step in the flow here, you can do that. So that brings me back to, just a really important tip that I'll probably circle back to at the end as well, is that always have the whole process plotted out, because you can really kind of get lost setting up all of these different conditions. So it's easier to kind of plot things out. What do you need to have happen ahead of time before trying to set this all up? Okay. So back in our handout here, I wanted to share with you another kind of cool idea you could use with paths. So we also have a Zapier trigger that works off of a status changing on a project in Dubsado. So this would be really great with a filter if you only had maybe every time the status changed to booked. And you only cared about the booked status, but every time a project changed a status and became booked, then you might set up a Zap that has a filter. It's triggered off of the status change, and the filter is looking at what the new status is and saying, make sure it's booked, and if yes, continue the Zap. Or maybe you have, some different things that happen based on what status a project changes to. So you might set up one Zap triggered by a status change. And on its own, again, the status change trigger will fire off anytime any project changes to any status. So we're just narrowing it down here. So for example, we could set up some paths. One path could be if the status changes to booked, so we'd use that rule at the top there. Then the action for that one might be adding a task in ClickUp. And then you could have another path. The status changes to past. Add the client to like a former client list in MailChimp. So you could really expand on this. If you have lots of things happening in outside systems beyond Dubsado that you can kind of work off of with statuses, this could be a really cool thing to put together. All right, and I'm going to leave you with some final tips for success with this. Just for success with Zapier in general. So just like a Dubsado workflow, always map out your process first. So knowing the steps ahead of time are going to greatly save you headaches when you're approaching automation. It's really the only way that you can do this. And normally in Dubsado, our workflows are more linear. So we kind of recommend that you write out steps. But with Zapier, now you can really start getting into your mind mapping because things can branch and go in different directions. So use Post-it notes on a wall, or fill a pad of paper, or work with a digital system. But whatever you do, get the ideas out of your head and onto a page or screen before you start setting up the automation. My second tip is always do your research. So with Zapier, there are so many possibilities, so many different apps. Each app is responsible for maintaining their own integration with Zapier. So, apps that you use may introduce new options for Zaps. So, stay on top of that. But absolutely, once you map out your process, make sure that you research the apps that you want to connect to first confirm what is possible. So just start by mapping things out, but then do some research ahead of time and see if the right triggers and actions exist in Zapier to help you, achieve that. And I might even suggest doing some preliminary tests so you can kind of play around with those actions and triggers with your specific situation to see if it will work for you before you go down the whole road of building out a giant Zap, for example. And finally, always test, and test again. We say this until we're blue in the face here, but testing really is the best way to ensure that you're getting the desired outcome from any form of automation, whether it's a Dubsado workflow or especially a Zap. Definitely run some tests. You will be very glad you did. And I just want to leave you with this idea as well, to be open to change and growth in your process. So, you have to, get out there and try something the first time, but you may start to discover some things that you could improve or expand on or even simplify in the future. But you're not going to find out any of those things unless you give it a try first. So I just want you to be open to making changes and not letting the fear of the possibility that you might have to change up your Zap in the future hold you back from getting started, because the only way to be able to make those decisions to change things is to actually get out there and start playing around with it first. So that is everything I have for you on Zaps and paths and filters. Again, take this, run with it. See, what is possible within your own process and the apps that you need to connect. Hopefully this gives you a good foundation to understand what is possible within Zapier. There's a whole lot more that's possible in this, and their help articles are great. So I recommend checking those out if you have even more advanced needs. But hopefully this got you on the right track.